he can't be replaced. You know, when they made him, sadly they threw the mould away, and so we'll miss him. We'll all miss him.
To me, he was a doyen of sports commentary.
Charlie George! Oh, he's done it! On the stroke of half-time! Charlie George!
Brian Clough was never a man who handed out admiration cheaply. Players knew it. Managers knew it. Journalists certainly knew it. Yet with Brian Moore, Clough was different. Moore interviewed Clough repeatedly and worked alongside him at ITV. Over time, they became genuine friends. Norman Giller, who knew both men, remembered Moore as one of the relatively few journalists Clough allowed close to him. Football connected them, but so did family, shared interests, and their love of Frank Sinatra. That friendship produced one of the finest tributes Moore ever received. During ITV's Over the Moon, Brian, Clough was secretly brought in to surprise him. Moore wasn't expecting him. Then Clough appeared. After drawing on the music they both loved, he delivered 4 simple words. "Brian, you're the top." Coming from Clough, they mattered. This was a man famous for brutal opinions and selective praise. Moore hadn't simply earned another television compliment. He had earned Clough's respect. Their friendship lasted long after individual matches disappeared into the archives. They even affectionately referred to one another as the other Brian. Then, in September 2001, Brian Moore died. By then, Clough's own health had deteriorated badly. He was frail. Making the journey to Moore's funeral wasn't easy. But Clough went. He arrived with his wife Barbara to say goodbye to his old friend. No television performance. No audience to impress. Just one football great, paying his respects to the voice that had accompanied an unforgettable era. If you believe the voices and legends of football's greatest years should never fade away, subscribe and help us keep their stories alive. Bob Wilson knew Brian Moore differently, not simply as the voice coming through a television set, but as a colleague and, eventually, a close friend. The former Arsenal and Scotland goalkeeper had spent years inside professional football before moving into broadcasting himself. So when Wilson judged Moore, he understood both worlds. And his verdict was extraordinary. After Moore's death, Wilson said, "I don't think there is anyone in the world of football who had a bad word to say about him." Think about that. Football was full of rivalries. Managers fought with journalists. Players distrusted broadcasters. Personalities clashed constantly. Yet Wilson struggled to think of anyone who disliked Brian Moore. At Moore's memorial service, his words became even more personal. Wilson fought back emotion as he remembered a man who had embraced him with friendship and compassion. He said Moore genuinely loved his work and football. But perhaps Wilson's most revealing observation had nothing to do with commentary. He always had a way of making everybody he met feel more important than himself. That was Brian Moore. By then, he had spent 3 decades as ITV's principal football voice. He had covered World Cups, European nights, and some of the biggest matches British audiences had ever watched. Yet according to Wilson, Moore possessed the unusual ability to make someone else feel like the important person in the room. And Wilson didn't merely admire him professionally. At the memorial, he called Moore a friend and an inspiration to those who knew him and to the millions who had listened to him. That explains something statistics never could. Brian Moore's greatness wasn't simply that millions recognized his voice. It was that the people who actually knew the man behind that voice seemed to respect him even more. And coming from Bob Wilson, a man who had experienced football from both the goalmouth and the television studio, that may be one of the finest tributes Moore ever received. Ron Atkinson knew exactly what Brian Moore was capable of. For years, the two shared ITV's commentary box. Moore provided the voice. Ron Atkinson provided the manager's eye. Together, they became part of the soundtrack to some of ITV's biggest football nights. And Atkinson's verdict on his colleague could hardly have been stronger. We've had some great commentators in this game, but I think he was the daddy of them all. That mattered. Atkinson had spent decades inside professional football. He had managed Manchester United, West Bromwich Albion, and Aston Villa. He knew great players, great managers, and he understood the pressure surrounding the biggest occasions. Yet beside Moore, he witnessed another kind of skill. Moore could control a major broadcast without trying to become the main attraction. He knew when excitement demanded more from his voice. He knew when Atkinson knew experience could add something. And crucially, He knew when the football itself should be allowed to speak. That apparent ease concealed serious preparation. Moore was known for arriving at grounds hours before kickoff, making sure that when the cameras went live, very little could surprise him. That combination of preparation, authority, and genuine enthusiasm helped make Moore and Atkinson such a familiar ITV partnership. But Atkinson's tribute ultimately reduced all those years together to one unmistakable judgment. There had been many great voices in football. For Ron Atkinson, Brian Moore remained the daddy of them all. Jack Charlton belonged to another part of Brian Moore's remarkable football world, a World Cup winner, a great manager, and one of the famous figures who appeared in Over the Moon, Brian, the ITV tribute celebrating Moore's career. But Charlton was far from the only great name connected to that tribute. Behind the scenes, Norman Giller had arranged something special. A framed cartoon portrait of Moore was prepared. Around it were gathered the signatures of some of the greatest footballers Britain had produced: Stanley Matthews, Tom Finney, George Best, Denis Law, Charlton, and other celebrated names from the game. Think about what those names represented. Matthews had become English football's first Ballon d'Or winner. Finney belonged among the finest players of his generation. Best and Law had become European Footballers of the Year. Charlton had conquered the world with England. These were the kind of men Brian Moore had spent decades describing. Now their names surrounded his. And another great footballer who worked closely with Moore gave an even more direct verdict. Kevin Keegan later said, "I worked with Brian Moore, who was the best." Keegan remembered something else too. At a World Cup final, Moore gave him a simple instruction: "Kevin, don't talk too much. Let the pictures do the talking." That small memory reveals something fundamental about Moore. He understood that the commentator wasn't the event. The football was. He didn't need to fill every silence. He didn't need to make every great moment about his own voice. He trusted the pictures. He trusted the crowd. And he trusted the people beside him. That may help explain why so many great football personalities seemed comfortable around him. Moore had never scored a famous goal, never won a European Cup, never represented England on the pitch. Yet after decades behind the microphone, Matthews, Finney, Best, Law, Charlton, and others were brought together in tribute to him. And Keegan's verdict was even simpler. He had actually worked beside Moore. He knew what happened when the cameras went live. And years later, he still called him the best. For a man who spent his career giving football's greatest players their soundtrack, there could hardly have been a finer compliment. John Motson understood better than most what Brian Moore's job demanded. For decades, they stood on opposite sides of British football television. Motson at the BBC, Moore at ITV. Different networks, different voices, but enormous respect. Motson described Moore as the perfect gentleman, and also remembered him as a model professional. That praise mattered. Because Motson understood the preparation, pressure, and concentration required to describe football's biggest occasions live. Martin Tyler belonged to the generation that followed. Before becoming one of football's most recognizable voices himself, Tyler worked in the ITV system, where Moore stood at the top. And years later, when Tyler discussed the great moments commentators are fortunate enough to inherit, he placed Moore in remarkable company. Kenneth Wolstenholme had the 1966 World Cup final. Tyler himself had Sergio Aguero's title-winning moment in 2012. And Brian Moore had Anfield in 1989, Liverpool against Arsenal. The championship decided on the final night. Arsenal needed a 2-goal victory at a ground where Liverpool seemed almost untouchable. They led 1-0 as the match entered its final moments. Then Michael Thomas broke through. Moore saw the possibility before millions of viewers fully understood it.
Ball by Dixon, finding Smith. But Thomas charging through the midfield. Thomas, it's up for grabs now. Thomas!
It's up for grabs now. Thomas scored. Arsenal were champions. The line became inseparable from the goal. Yet its brilliance came from what Moore did next. He didn't fight the moment. He allowed the pictures, the crowd, and the extraordinary scenes at Anfield to carry it. That was Brian Moore's craft. Preparation before the match. Clarity during it. And when football produced something greater than anything a commentator could manufacture, knowing when to let the game speak for itself. Motson recognized the professional. Tyler recognized the historic voice. and Anfield showed exactly why both judgments mattered. Clive Tyldesley faced perhaps the most difficult compliment Brian Moore could ever receive. He had to replace him. Tyldesley returned to ITV in 1996 as Moore's understudy. 2 years later, after Moore's final World Cup, the microphone passed to him, and Tyldesley knew exactly whose place he was taking. Looking back, he described Moore as great as a man as well as a commentator. But one of his finest memories came away from the commentary box. When Moore retired, ITV held a dinner in his honour. Tyldesley was seated beside the man he was about to succeed. After a couple of bottles of wine, Moore leaned towards him. There are only 2 things you need to remember. Tyldesley prepared himself for some great secret of football commentary. Moore's advice was wonderfully simple. Be on time and be warm enough. That was Moore. No grand theory. No attempt to make the profession sound more complicated than it was. Tyldesley later understood the message in his own way. Turn up, be prepared, and then do the job. The scale of Moore's legacy became obvious almost immediately. In Tyldesley's first season as ITV's senior commentator, Manchester United reached the 1999 Champions League final. Around 20 million people were watching in Britain. 2 late goals transformed the match. Tyldesley knew that getting such occasions right was now his responsibility. The seat once occupied by Brian Moore belonged to him. Yet Moore's influence did not disappear when the microphone changed hands. Tyldesley would go on to call World Cups, European Championships, and Champions League finals across more than 2 decades. And still, when remembering the man who came before him, his judgment remained beautifully simple. Brian Moore had been great behind the microphone. But to the man who inherited his position, he had been something more. Great as a man, too. Brian Moore never needed football's biggest stadiums to remind him why he loved the game. For all the World Cups, European finals, and unforgettable nights behind the microphone, part of him always belonged to Gillingham. He had supported the club since boyhood. Later, he served as a director. And eventually, a stand at Priestfield would carry his name. Moore could describe the greatest players on earth and still care deeply about football far away from the glamour. Fame never seemed to change that. His son Christopher remembered that during live broadcasts, Moore occasionally slipped tiny private messages into his commentary for his wife, Betty. To millions watching, they sounded like ordinary words. But Betty knew what they meant. Her husband was thinking of her. It was a small detail, but one that revealed the man behind the famous voice. And when his full-time commentary career ended, after the 1998 World Cup final, Moore still wasn't finished with football. He later interviewed former players, including Peter Harris and Ray Crawford, men from another era whose stories were beginning to disappear. Moore had spent decades surrounded by football royalty, yet he never believed only royalty deserved to be remembered. Perhaps that is why his own memory has lasted. The World Cups mattered, the European nights mattered, and Anfield in 1989 will forever belong partly to those unforgettable words. It's up for grabs now. But those who knew Moore remembered something deeper. His decency, his preparation, his enthusiasm, his humility, and his ability to make football important without making himself the most important person in it. Despite friends campaigning for official recognition, Moore never received the major state honour they believed he deserved. Football gave him something different. Its trust, its affection, and a permanent place in its memory. Today, the Brian Moore stands still, looks across Priestfield. Old recordings return that unmistakable voice to another generation, and commentators who followed him still speak about the standard he set. Brian Moore spent decades giving words to football's greatest moments. In return, football's greatest names gave us their verdict on Brian Moore. The legends trusted him, his colleagues admired him, and the supporters never forgot him. If you believe the great voices, characters, and stories of football's past deserve to live on, subscribe and help us keep their memories alive for the next generation. The microphone eventually passed to somebody else, but Brian Moore's voice never really left the game.